This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
Welcome to the Stanford Seminar on People, Computers, and Design. Next week we are on Thanksgiving break, and so there will be no talk. We'll resume in 2 weeks. Today we have James Landay, and James has had a really fantastic career to date, and I wanted to share with you 2 reasons why I think his career has been particularly impactful. One of them is that, so James got his PhD from Carnegie Mellon in 1996, and he was one of the first technical people in the HCI community to really champion design. He's been an early and persistent champion of the role of design in human-computer interaction, and in bringing it into the fold for the field, and in teaching its methods, and he's had a huge influence there. Another thing to know about James is that the number of students who he's advised who have gone on to do all sorts of cool things, some of them are slackers like me, but many of his students have gone on and done great things, including faculty positions at a wide variety of universities and leading industrial research positions and a bunch of other stuff. And I think that what's remarkable is that many of his former students are doing really different stuff. And so it's not like he built 10 clones of himself, but he's figured out how to foster a community that really helps people find their own way and succeed for themselves. And watching that community continue to grow and blossom has been extremely cool. And now he's going to tell you about his next biggest venture, which is World Lab.
I mean, really what Scott says, academia, it's really about the students, and I've been really lucky to work with lots of really great, smart students, but just great people like Scott and Jeff and many others. What I want to talk about today is what Scott said, World Lab, and I'm going to talk about design, and I'm going to talk about technology. But one thing you might not know about me, I was a professor at Berkeley, and then I've been at the University of Washington for 10 years, including a stint running an industrial research lab there for Intel. I spent almost 3 years over the last 4 years in China. My family and I went and lived in Beijing, took a sabbatical that just kind of kept extending, something nice about the university. They say, I'm going to stay away a little while. And that time in China was really important for me culturally, important for me with respect to my career, important for my family. Because right now in China, it's a really exciting time. You really feel it in the people that they see. It's an important time in their history, politically, economically, socially. But China also has a 5,000-year history as a civilization. And it was interesting to me to see how people actually take stories and idioms from that history and use it in their everyday thinking and speech. And so I'm going to start out with a story for you from China and use this as part of my talk. So what you see here is this bronze galloping horse. This is a horse that was made in solid bronze. It's 2,000 years old from the Han Dynasty. It was only uncovered in 1969 in the west of China, and it's actually an important cultural symbol. It's the official symbol of tourism China. But what's really interesting is when they discovered this in 1969, it took several years for the experts who were baffled as to how was this cast in solid bronze such that it didn't topple over. Because what we see here is the legend of this heaven steed was that the horse was so fast in the west of China that it literally flew. And so this horse, all the hooves are in the air except for this one hoof here, and it's a little hard to see, that is actually stampeding on a swallow that is flying and looking up in horror as this kind of flying horse is coming by. And so it actually baffled the experts of how did this person cast this in solid bronze as to not fall over. And so in some ways, this horse represents balance to me. It represents balance between the beauty of the artistry of the horse and between that design and artistry of that and the technology to somehow calculate where the center of mass would be so it wouldn't fall over. And in fact, the center of mass is in the swallow there at the bottom. And I actually think finding this balance between design and technology, hey Eric, welcome, is a really important theme in terms of the kind of technologies that we design and build today. Finding this balance between them, taking advantage of our skills on both sides is what leads to new technologies that are desirable. So we really need to find this balance between, for example, human-centered approaches that we get from design and human-computer interaction and more technology-centered approaches from computer science and kind of bring those together. And even within subfields like human-computer interaction, I feel like we need to find a balance between careful, controlled experiments of slightly new things that we invent versus creating brand new systems that just totally change the world in new ways that we can't necessarily control that easily and experiment with. And we need to do both kinds of work. And I'm going to try to talk about some of this as I go forward. My time in China also leads me to believe that we can actually find value by finding balance between different cultures and different ways of thinking. For example, this very collective culture that we see in Eastern cultures versus the more individualistic culture we see from the West, and that by seeing things from different perspectives, that actually leads us to more creativity and new solutions to problems that we might be attacking. So balance is really key in this way. So in the rest of the talk, I want to discuss three big problem areas that I think we as a field should really be working on, and how looking at them in this balanced approach between design and technology, and also in some instances between cultures, can lead us to interesting new solutions. So I'm going to start out first talking about a balance between us as humans and our environment. Here you see Lake Mead, which is expected to drop below its intake pipes in the next few years. Now, you might just say, hey, don't build cities in the desert. Kind of stupid. You know, LA, Phoenix, Vegas. But the fact is 36 US states are expected to have major water shortage problems over the next 5 years. And global warming is going to cause this to be more and more common in many places across the world. We've obviously seen these issues in Africa and other places for a long time. One thing I didn't know, you know, and this is just being kind of, you know, as an American, we're very inward looking. Going to live in China was that China has really kind of faced this same kind of issue for 50 or 100 years, in that a lot of the population in China lives in northern China, which is very arid and dry. And in fact, when I was in Beijing, they were literally trucking snow and melting it in the middle of winter to get water for Beijing, that there's such a severe water shortage. Beijing's pretty much a desert. Okay. Now, in China, they're actually building one of the largest engineering projects ever, which is essentially to move the water from the three major rivers in the south to the north. Okay. This is like a 100-year project. In fact, Mao first proposed it, I think, in 1952. Construction started in 2002, and I think the first big part of it is coming online just around now, and it will continue for another 40 years or so. And as part of that project, millions and millions of people are displaced from their homes. There's huge environmental consequences of that project. And so we might think about, you know, what are things that we might do in our own lives that might lead us to not have such water shortages, or use that resource better, such that maybe we don't need projects like that. So when I try to think of areas like this, I want to think as a researcher to think, what would it be a big, audacious goal? You know, as a, not just for my research group, but as a field, what is something that we could try to really achieve? So in this area, we might say, could we cut a family's energy and water use in a significant way, let's say by 50%? Now, you might say, hey, give me $1 million, I can build you a house off the grid, and, you know, it gets its own water and energy. But let's say we said, you know, for $5,000 or $10,000, could we take existing families' homes and how they use transportation, et cetera? The solutions to these kind of problems, I think, are going to involve policy. You know, for example, if we put higher taxes on gasoline, it's going to change, you know, how people drive, or if we require higher mileage standards, that's going to have impact. So there's always policy and planning issues that come into this. But from what we do here in this room, I think, can we think of technologies that might help with this, as well as design in changing people's behavior that might have impact in these problem areas? So I'm going to focus on that design and technology, because those are the types of things that we do. So for example, one of the projects that we've done at the University of Washington is called Hydrosense. This was work really led by my colleague Shwetak Patel, working with another colleague, James Fogarty, and grad student who was leading a lot of this was John Freilich, who was working with me, and John is now a professor at the University of Maryland. And really the key insight that they had was you can think of your pipe network in your home as an information network. And by carefully sensing changes in the pressure through those pipes, you could actually sense very inexpensively any valve opening or closing in that network and tell what faucet's being used in your home. And you could also get a pretty good estimate for the volume of water used. Now this is kind of cool because you can do it with a really inexpensive sensor that might cost, $20 or $30. And in fact, they did a startup and got bought by Belkin, who makes all these iPhone and other stuff. And it's going to be available in your store, any month now, supposedly before Christmas, but maybe it's going to fall in the first quarter. And get one of these maybe for $100. One sensor, really inexpensively, be able to tell us. That's the cool technology. For me, as an HCI person, more of my interest was, well, what do we do with the design? How do we use that information in a way where we might be able to change people's actual behavior? And just to give you a better idea, here's how it works in terms of the valves opening and closing. Just at the high level, the key thing to understand is this is someone opening a faucet here at the top. The middle is a toilet running, and then the bottom is a tub filling. And the key is just to see that those waveforms look different. Even the open faucet and the closed faucet look different, and the toilet open, the tub open. So you can imagine with some basic signal processing, machine learning, you can learn these different patterns and be able to detect it. And in fact, they get, in the neighborhood of 95 to 98% accuracy, depending on how well you want to know exactly where in the home versus the type of faucet and hot versus cold. If you have two of these, you get like 99% accuracy. So for me, the question was design. And in some ways, this is a lot of what John focused on at the end of his dissertation was how might we use that information to change behavior. And I put this slide in the other day because I like to use in my undergraduate class these kind of Hall of Fame, Hall of Shame examples. And one I have is always the smart fridge. I'm kind of like, who wants a smart fridge? And I was finding like, wait, the smart fridge, I can actually use a display in that thing for something useful for once. So you could imagine maybe in some high traffic place in your home, maybe it's the fridge, maybe it's on some counter, that you have some display that you look at it on a regular basis and it shows you kind of your water use. And then the key is how do you design that in a way that would cause behavior change? So actually John led a team and literally looked at dozens and dozens of different design ideas that look at different design dimensions in this area and did this very extensive online study of something like 800 people to look at how they understood these dimensions. And then we did some in-lab studies with people and then in some in-home studies to understand where they would place this technology. And so in this talk, I'm just going to show you a couple of the examples that I think are very illustrative of what we were doing. So in this example, we have like an aquatic ecosystem. So it's almost like a gamified water savings. And so here we kind of see your water savings tracker. And if the family met their goal for the month or the week, then, this fish meets his mate. And, and if you meet it again, they have some little guppies or whatever you call baby fish here. And, maybe you get a windmill in there at some point, it becomes more of a hipster aquarium, I don't know. So, and it's also touch sensitive. Kids really like this one that we tested with some families. Another one here is what we called rain flow. And this one was really trying to get out more of, you want to let people understand what's the underlying activity that's tied to their water use. Because actually we did surveys with people. People are really poor at understanding the top areas that they use water in their homes. There's 3 areas that are the most common, and we found that most people get at least one of those areas wrong, and if not 2. And so letting them really understand for what activities they're using water might help them better. In this one, we can kind of see, it's like showering versus toileting versus washing dishes or washing clothes. And you might have goals for those things. And if you go over your goal, something bad happens. So here, again, we've sped it up over time. This design also had the weather and the date and time and some news headlines. The idea being there's reasons you would want to glance at it regularly, in your home during the day so that you would start to understand this information. And again, this one was on a touch screen, so it had this nice little animation. And here we see for toileting, we go over the goal, and it eventually overflows, okay? Now, the next step in this research would really be to deploy it in homes for multiple months and have some kind of control and have some ground truth to understand whether we are affecting the behavior. This didn't get done yet. John got his PhD, moved off to be a professor, so we need to still do that. And that's really important. You know, for example, I won't say my kids, because I said that in my last talk and they got really mad. They watched it on TV. Some kids might think, hey, let's flush the toilet a lot to see that display come out. So maybe this design actually does the opposite of what you want. So you really need to actually test these kind of things in the field for extended periods and see if you get the behavior change. And then even further, we need to, as a field, understand what happens when you take them away. Have we changed people's behavior, or do you need these things ongoing? Those are things the field hasn't even gotten the right methods to do well. People in behavior psychology have done some of this, but in HCI and CS and UBComp, you know, most people say that's too much for a dissertation or too much work, and we're still trying to figure out how do you make these kinds of studies easier to pull off. We've also worked in transportation, because a large amount of your energy usage is in personal transportation. So an earlier project we did was called UB Green. John led the authorship of this, though it was several people, including my colleagues at Carnegie Mellon, led by Jennifer Mainkoff and students. And the idea here was, could we sense your transportation behavior on your phone, and using the background screen of the phone, give you feedback when your transportation was green, and try to kind of encourage you to do those good behaviors. So as you went through your week, you would see what your most recent transportation mode was, and these leaves would grow across this tree, and eventually these flowers would bloom. And at the bottom, we also tried to tie these other values that people felt were even more important than being green. For example, saving money, being calm, getting exercise, or being able to do something else while commuting. So in this case, when you carpooled, you saved money. And when you take the bus here, maybe it's depending which bus you're on. I know some people's buses aren't very calm. But, you know, for example, the bus over the Bay Bridge versus driving, I'd say the bus is calmer. Or be able to read. And so then if you met your goal for the week, in this interface design, we had these apples or fruit appear. And we actually had another interface design that the folks from CMU were really pushing, because they had some theories about how if people bonded with animals, it would lead to more behavior change. So there was this other version here where we had this polar scene. And the more green you were, the polar scene became healthier and healthier, in that the ice grew and there were more polar bears, and they had polar bear babies and fish and stuff like that. And then if you met your goal here, the northern lights came out. Okay, and that's what happened. Now, there were some surprising results in the experiments that we ran for this. We kind of thought those ambient displays, you know, that graphics you just saw there, were just really to kind of tell you what you were doing and give you information so you would be self-aware of what your behavior was. So we ran a pilot study. All this was 4 weeks long, and there were 12 people across 2 cities. For behavior change, this is really a pilot. You're really going to be looking at something at least 3 to 6 months long with that many people or more. So this was kind of shake it out study. So, you know, there's some informal results. Several people wanted to keep running it. That's always good with research software. If somebody wants to run it on your crappy old phone like you saw in that thing, that's a good sign. We saw some behavior change. I think some of our participants were a little too green already, especially those Seattle people. Though we had people in Pittsburgh who were like driving 3/4 of a mile to their friend's house, and they said, I'm not going to do that anymore. So we maybe helped the Pittsburghers. You know, Eric, you might be able to confirm my theories there. The thing that I think was the most interesting research result, which was less related to this particular problem, was people described this in the interviews as, oh, I'd show the story to my wife, or somebody at work said, hey, what's going on with your polar bear? Or what does the tree look like now? They almost thought of it as a game in some ways. And to me, it was like, what game? It's just a, you know, display, and we had some leaves, you know. But people, even with this very simple graphics, were seeing this like a story. And this really led me to believe that using these kind of really simple stories for these behavior change applications could be a way to drive long-term engagement. Because I think one of the problems that if you build these type of systems to deal with is kind of a novelty effect. It kind of seems cool at first, but then you're sick of it. But you can imagine authoring simple stories like this that people stay engaged to kind of see what happens, and then maybe you subscribe to a news story, or maybe even have end user contributed stories. They're pretty easy to author that people could subscribe to just by getting a theme and not knowing what's going to happen. So it was surprising people were fairly engaged with what I thought was a fairly simplistic story. So I think we can use that in a lot of other places. Another issue in this behavior change area is cultural. And this is why I say it's important to understand different cultures. A lot of the behavior change work we've done in health and environment, and I'll show you some health stuff in a minute, is based on a lot of psychology literature and other literature. BJ Fogg here has done a lot of work here at Stanford. And a lot of this stuff says you should stay fairly positive in the feedback that you give people. And if you give a lot of negative feedback, people are going to stop using your system. I was in Beijing only for a couple of months, and I went to a seminar at Microsoft, and a Japanese researcher came in, and he had a bunch of interfaces that looked really similar to what we had built. And I was like, these guys are copying our work. What is this stuff? And he didn't know who I was, and he said, now, we've seen a lot of this work at Intel in Seattle and the University of Washington, and they have all this positive feedback. And he said, we have negative feedback, because everyone knows in Asia you need negative feedback. Okay, and I was like, huh, do you have some evidence of that? Is there some literature, paper, something? He said, no, but everyone knows. And they didn't actually test their stuff, so we don't know. But to me, that was like, oh, that's a cool research question. Is there a cultural difference in this type of feedback? So we've started one project there that I would say is not definitive in answering this question, but leads us to have some information on it. We did an online study with 180 Chinese and Americans. And in this study, they first had to fill out a standard carbon calculator talking about their home and their lifestyle and their transportation needs. And then they got some feedback from the system on how they were doing, and we manipulated that feedback in a careful way. Some people getting positive and negative feedback, and then they had to make pledges about what changes they would make in their life, and there were suggestions that they could grab from this thing to do that. And then they reported back later on which changes they made in their lives. And these steps happened over several weeks. They weren't all at the same time. So some flaws in this study are it's a self-report study. There's no ground truth for us to know what's true, but there are some interesting things. So we thought feedback that was positive would be best based on everything we knew. It was really interesting. For the Chinese participants, negative feedback led to the biggest change in pro-environmental behavior. Okay, statistically significant difference. For the Americans, positive feedback was bigger, but I don't know if it's true. It wasn't statistical difference there.
So can you say more? What is negative feedback?
In terms of, we could look at the results and say, you aren't doing as well as other people in the same kind of have same size home as you do and things like this. So how we couched, how we told them what their performance was when they did the carbon calculator. Simply that statement, how we stated it, being positive or negative, okay? And so we were able to control how we did that to half the people. So again, I don't feel like this result's definitive, but it's kind of like, I think there's something there. And so again, the next step would be, for example, if we were doing our water display deployment, it would be interesting to do it in China versus the US and also manipulate this variable and see when we have ground truth, does that hold? Maybe it doesn't hold over long periods of time. Maybe too much negative will get you to not want to use the system. We're not sure of that. This is, again, one-time use, self-report. So there's some issues, but it's interesting to see, at least on the surface, that there was some kind of difference between these sets of people. So culture may determine how to give feedback in these kind of behavior change situations, and it certainly shouldn't be ignored. It seems important to consider. The next area I want to kind of describe about balance is really balance between people and their own bodies and balance between exercise and food and things like this. What you're seeing here is not a map of what states voted which way last week, but this is actually data from the Center for Disease Control. And what it's showing is the body mass index being greater than 30. 30 means clinically obese. That's when we start to get a lot of correlated health issues, diabetes, heart disease, et cetera, for folks. So this is one they really care about. And what we see is in 1990, most of the states are a dark green or a slightly lighter green, meaning dark green. Less than 10% of the population of that state had BMIs greater than 30, and then the other states were 10 to 15% of their population. And the ones that are gray mean they didn't have data for those states at this time. Now, what you're about to see, I think, won't be too surprising to people. What's surprising to me is kind of the speed of this. So as we go through the 90s, we get some more yellowing in the states. We start to see some light oranges as we get to around 2000. We go Colorado, the place to live if you want to be healthy. You know, all those bikers, runners, triathletes, but even the Coloradans can't keep up with this trend. So as we get through the 2000s, we start to get those red states getting orange, okay? And here's the latest data, 2010, okay? In 2010, you're looking at 12 states that have about a third of their population clinically obese. We have 24 states that have over a quarter of their population, and then, you know, the remaining are 14 states are 20 to 25%. It's a lot, and in fact, if you even look at just numbers of the population, I think it's over 50% are now in the overweight, which is the one category below this, or obese. So it's a big problem, and I think most of us knew it. I think what was really interesting when I first saw this animation myself was just how quickly that happened. You know, in 20 years, this just went crazy like this. And there's a lot of different explanations having to do with, you know, more of a car culture, subsidized corn, you know, corn sugar, video games, and people feeling less comfortable with their kids playing outside. There's all these things, and it's probably some combination of these things together. But what we're looking at is an epidemic, it's an obesity epidemic. And again, this is another problem that feels to me worth us spending our time to work on and see what can we do about it versus just coming up with the latest next cool game or something like that. So, you know, what can we do from an HCI and technology perspective that might help people with this? Now, again, something that was interesting to me living in China's developing world, or, you know, in the middle of developed and developing, was the US, if you ever lived overseas, seems to export a lot of the things we're less proud of. Kind of bad food, you'll see McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken everywhere, bad movies. It's like, why? They don't get the good films. There are good ones. They don't just go and they get the big bad blockbusters. Surprising, you know, even this kind of obesity and overeating. More than 7% of Chinese children are obese, second only in the US. This comes from the Chinese National Task Force on Childhood Obesity. Statistics out of China, you have to be skeptical a lot. I'm not sure whether that's true, but definitely you see it across this burgeoning middle and upper class, 400 million to 500 million people in China, still leaving 400 or 500 who are really poor, but that's still a lot of people who are starting to have money, they're starting to have these Western lifestyles, and especially among boys, culturally, it was a tradition that, you know, you would eat well to show your wealth. And here we see, this was from the People's Daily, it was a weight loss camp with a kind of militaristic theme in Shanghai that was in the paper. So what would an audacious goal here be? Something like, could we increase your physical activity daily by 100%? And we can work on the eating thing. It's its own hard problem. I have another project on that. But look, how about just physical activity? Okay, could we get those BMI levels back to 1990? Might be the other way of stating this. So one project that we did at Intel, and I'll take this question in 1 second, was called UbiFit. And we were really trying to attack this issue. What's your question?
So how do you decide what's a good number? So increasing physical activity by 100% sounds like a good idea. Is it enough?
How do you decide what's a good goal or a good number is the question. I don't have a very great way to do that. And I actually thought about these in a hard way in that I thought of what would be a hard goal to reach, you know, and does it seem like it'd be significant? You know, with the energy one, I could have said 20%. And there's a lot of research backing us up that we know how to do that right now. So I actually wanted to try to push to what I wasn't sure I knew how to reach in that one. In this one, I think I have seen numbers in terms of like what a recommended daily step counts for people and what the averages are, and it is kind of in this territory. So I don't know if that number is exactly what you want, and we probably want to attack the food issue at the same time. So it's, again, a piece of the problem, and it's meant to be kind of a goal that energizes people towards achieving the research. Yeah, Gilbert.
Similar question is, do we have any idea how people's exercise, food consumption, et cetera, has changed over the past 20 years?
I've read articles about how, people are more sedentary and people are eating more food, but I can't give you like an exact 20% number or anything like that. So this project called UbiFit ended up being the PhD dissertation for Sunny Consalvo, who was a researcher at the Intel lab, but also pursuing her PhD at the University of Washington in our information school. And the basic idea here was, we felt with mobile computing technology advancing, that by using sensing and machine learning, we could actually sense what physical activity people are engaged in the real world. And by understanding what you're doing and feeding that information back to you so people could be more aware of what they were doing, because people really aren't aware of how much they exercise, how much they walk, how much they sit at their desk, et cetera, we could help people meet their goals and change their behavior. Because often people already know they want to do more. They have a hard time sticking with what their plans are to change. So in this system, we had a wearable device called the Intel Mobile Sensing Platform, which had like 10 different sensors in it, like accelerometers and light sensing, and it had its own processor and storage and Bluetooth. And then we had, at the time, the best smartphone you could get, which could barely run the graphics to keep that screen going. So we kind of separated the computing between these two devices. You wear this one on your belt or something, and then the information would be transmitted to that phone. So that's the basic architecture of how it worked. And what you see on the background of that phone is really the key idea here, is what we call an ambient display. So this garden would start out as just green grass on Sunday. But as you engaged in physical activity, these flowers would grow. And different flowers would appear depending on what you did. So if you took a walk of 10 minutes or more, a sunflower would appear. If you did aerobic activity like running, biking, stair machine, elliptical trainer, then one of these orange flowers would appear. And if you did strength training or stretching, which you had to manually enter because we didn't sense those, the wider blue flowers would appear. And so the idea is, over your week, your garden would grow. And if you met your goal for the week, this butterfly would appear. Now, the basic idea of the ambient display is not that you look at the ambient display and say, oh, I walked 3 times and I ran 4 times and I did this. The idea was, every time you pull out that phone to check the time, every time you pull out that phone to do an SMS, every time you pull out that phone to play a game, you're seeing that background screen first before you do something else, and you're becoming more and more aware of what your current activity is. And in fact, if late in the week it looked like this, you would feel fairly good about yourself, going, I'm meeting my goals, I'm doing well. But if late in the week, Friday, let's say, it looked like this, you might feel, boy, I better take my gym bag today, or ride my bike to work instead of taking the bus, and do something to kind of get towards your goals. That was the basic idea. And I think this is an idea that many of the commercial products haven't really figured out yet, and is one of their problems. Like, here's the Fitbit, everyone likes it, it's got cool design and all this stuff. But unless I think to take it out and like go, hey, how many should I step today? 6,000 steps, doing okay? I won't know. I have to think about it. Whereas the idea here is we're taking advantage of how much you use your phone for all these other things to grab your attention, but in a subtle way. So that's what that looked like from a UI point of design. From the underlying technology, we had this Intel mobile sensing platform. It essentially is collecting all these different sensor readings at different frequencies, and then calculating features, means, medians, all kinds of other simple mathematical equations on them, and then kind of coming up with an n-best list of what activity it thought you were doing at each instance. Okay, so like, 3 times a second, it's inferring like walking, Landay's walking, running, standing, walking. And then this information was sent over Bluetooth to the phone, which then on an application-wide basis could figure out how to smooth that into what it needed for that application. So for example, for UbiFit, it might try to look over longer periods what you're thinking it's doing. On the other hand, if I wanted to make an application that when I'm walking and looking at my phone, it makes things bigger so I can not run into light posts and things, it might do that much quicker, that smoothing, depending on your application. Again, as I said, we originally did this paper that Tanzim Chowdhury led a lot of the machine learning work on this, but this paper is like a physics paper or old physics paper with like 20 people. A lot of engineering work to go from machine learning algorithms that could be published in AI conferences and everyone says works to making it really work on a real device and do real apps with it. That amount of engineering actually led to a whole nother PhD dissertation. Kayur Patel just finished on tools for machine learning because of how hard that was. Now, we didn't think people are going to want to wear these things. We're playing the usual computer science trick of how do we throw some money at something to predict the future by throwing things today that eventually will be miniaturized and cheap. And so only 3 or 4 years after we first started this, we took one of the first iPhones and first Android phones and one of the Windows mobile phones at the time and rewrote the software and showed you could do the activity inference on stock smartphone. And the biggest remaining thing at that point was, can you do it without killing your battery? And a bunch of researchers at Dartmouth and UCLA and other places have now shown how to be smart about cycling the sensors to actually do this. So this technology could be in a good app today without killing your phone, be able to understand what physical activity you're doing more than just saying you're walking or running. We really could tell a bunch of these activities. Now, there were some surprising results in the studies here. Sunny actually ran both a pilot study similar to the one you saw there for UB Green earlier, that was 3 weeks, 12 or 14 people, really to work out the kinks in the UI and also the activity inference. And we found a bunch of bugs where somebody was sitting in a chair at home and it said they were biking, mislabeled training data, things like this. But then for the PhD dissertation, she ran this much more long-term and careful study. And going into this as the computer scientist in this group and kind of leading this team, I thought activity inference is the real key thing. This is the thing we've been working on for 2 years, make this activity inference really work. This is the key. But we tested it. And we did a 3-month field trial with 28 different people, and we had 3 different conditions. So in the first condition there was what I would call the full system. They had everything, activity inference, the ambient display with the garden, and there was also an application you could run to enter data, for example, strength training or stretching, or correct the inference if it was wrong, or it just didn't notice that I went running, I could put it in there. So really 3 components. Then we had a group of people who had no activity inference. They had to manually enter everything using that application, but they still had that ambient display. And then we had a third condition where we had activity inference, but there was no ambient display. The only way you could see your performance is run the app, and there you would see it. But it wouldn't be there every time you pulled your phone out. You would have to, like me on my Fitbit, thinking, hey, how much did I run? I'd have to look at it, okay? What was interesting is the study was run during a period of time that we thought was a horrible time to run an exercise fitness study, which was right now. We had to run this study kind of right before Thanksgiving in the US, and it ran through the winter holidays and past New Year's. And we had to run it at that time due to political, financial reasons in the lab. I was no longer the lab director, and the next guy said, you guys need to finish this project or we're taking the money away. It's like, okay, we got to run the study. It ended up being a great time for us to run the study. We didn't understand it when we ran it because there was a lot of prior literature that talked about exercise at this time of year and shows that people drop off their exercise, at least living in the northern hemisphere at this time of year, due to it gets darker, especially if you live in Seattle. It gets wetter. You might even have snow in the east. There's these holidays where often people are traveling and they're eating differently and they get knocked off their routines. And so people drop off. What was interesting is in this study, the only condition where people were able to maintain their exercise through that 3 months was the folks who had the ambient display, okay? Whether you had activity inference or not didn't matter to that. And the people who did not have ambient displays dropped off, as the prior research would say. So no matter how much I wanted to feel, God, the key feature was activity inference, and I actually still think it's important. In fact, all the participants said they wanted it. And I think over, again, long-term use, people drop off in doing journaling, so I think you still want it. the ambient display is more important in this case for the behavior change and is the key feature. And again, it's one that you saw us use in UB Green later, which we actually did after this project, and also in some of the water displays. A way to communicate to people what their real behavior is. And again, you know, the only one of these fitness things that I think is sort of gets this is the Nike Fuel Band, sort of has some ambient display, but there's other ones. The one from Jawbone, for example, again, you don't know it till you like sync it with your phone. There's a new Fitbit where you can start to look at your phone, but they still haven't figured it out that this is actually would be the important feature for making behavior change. We actually try to combine some of these ideas together at Microsoft in this new one that we call Huzuki. And what we were looking at here was in China, I was curious, what would a kind of a green application in China be? And so being, you know, an HCI researcher, the first thing we did is we did field work. I had some psychology students from Peking University as interns. We went out and did field work. And when we talked to Chinese folks about green activity and an application to help them be more green, the response was quite negative. In fact, people said, I wouldn't want people to know that I'm green. They would think I couldn't afford water or I couldn't afford the energy. So there are actually social reasons why you even would not necessarily want people to know about this, that we see almost opposite effects here in the US, where like people want the Prius because it's like a badge that I'm green. They don't want the one that looks just like a regular old car and just happens to be green. Okay, and so in China the effect was opposite, though again, among a younger population, I think that was starting to change. But one thing that did come up, and one good thing about doing field work is listening to people and coming up with new ideas. Some of the participants said, hey, if the green activity had to do also with my health, then I'd be more interested. So people were interested in health. And that gave us the idea of building an application that kind of combined some of these ideas that looked more at your holistic wellness. So it looked at your environmental wellness, your physical wellness, and your mental wellness. And this was Huzuki. And you would sort of check into those activities. And then using the ideas that we talked about in terms of stories and games, there was this character, Zuki, who, you know, you might look at it and go, what is Zuki? Yeah, it was who is Zuki? You don't know who Zuki is. But Zuki has to go over these barriers, like cross this water here, or go over a mountain, or climb through a wall, or whatever. And he gives you hints along the way. And as he achieves these things based on your activity, he starts to reveal more and more of who he is. And so the mystery is revealed after several weeks or months playing the game, and then maybe you subscribe to another one. So this was kind of an idea of combining some of these concepts. This one was in the middle of being built and actually has not been deployed. The student who was working on it has shifted to some other work. So yeah, question. What's your name, by the way?
Chinmay.
Chinmay.
A couple of questions actually. So first, about the Thanksgiving study. Do you have any idea why people continue to exercise? Was it simply they're trying to get a little bit of green in the middle of winter?
On the UBFit study?
Yeah, the one that you ran over Thanksgiving and winter break.
Yeah.
So was it simply that people wanted a little bit of green?
No, I mean, this is purely about fitness, this study.
Yeah.
And these are people who chose to participate in the study who wanted to be more fit. So they, in the model of behavior change, they were already making a plan to change their fitness. So everyone was motivated to do it. So they wanted this. This is why they were participating. I mean, they were compensated to run the study also, but people wanted to get more fit. These were people who were trying to improve their fitness.
I didn't exactly catch it. Did you say that they exercised more or they maintained?
No, they set goals for exercise. And the goals were based on a baseline and then trying to improve on that. And those people were able to maintain their goals through the study, and the other people were dropped off and were not able to maintain the goals. Okay? Any other questions about the health before I move to this next area? Okay, so we'd also done work with elder care in that area too, but I didn't have time to talk about it.
General question,
yeah.
You mentioned earlier, BJ Fogg, to what degree do you find that you can take theoretical accounts of persuasion and motivation and goals and so on and apply those theoretical insights? And to what extent is it more a common sense matter of trying things out?
Goal setting theory, which is described really well in survey papers by Locke and Latham, is really one of the key ideas in both UB Green UbiFit, that by having people set goals and having those goals appear, achievement of the goals appear in the interface is one of the really key ideas in there. There's other persuasion techniques that you could use, but that was the one that we've used a lot and it's worked. But then there's other things that we learn by doing the work. So for example, in that 3-week UbiFit study, you could set a goal. And if you met your goal, this butterfly appeared. And then when Sunday came around, your garden cleared out, your butterfly went away, and you start over. Well, you know, you test the stuff for real and you see what happens. Well, one thing happened, and I know in my own behavior with the system, come Saturday, I'm going on a run around the lake, I'm walking the dog that night, maybe that morning, I'm doing whatever it takes to meet my goal, you know? And so a lot of people didn't get their little butterfly till Friday night or Saturday, and then Sunday it's gone. You know, like you win the thing and then boom, it's gone. So one change was, in the later version, this little kind of like butterfly would appear off to the side for the previous 3 weeks if you met your goal. So there's some memory of the goal to kind of remind you had done well, rather than just, hey, I got it and then it's gone. Another issue we ran into was, let's say you get a really busy week. You have a grant deadline or a paper and you just don't get to the gym and you're just like, there's no way I'm going to meet my goal. Then you kind of give up. And you're just like, forget it. There's no chance. So we added this idea that you could set a secondary goal that's kind of lower and you can't do it every week, but then you still have something to shoot for and you'd get like a little butterfly if you reached it, or it's more like a moth. It was white. So again, those, I don't know if those are in that literature, but they were just ideas that came out of doing the study that ended up really succeeding and people really liked in the final system. And in hindsight, maybe they would have been obvious, oh yes, you should have designed that. But sometimes you got to build it and test it and see what happens. And I thought those were two cool ideas that came out of doing the study. So the last area that I'll talk about balance is in education. This one's interesting for me in that China and the US, I think, are fairly different in this way, but it's in a kind of symmetrical way. So in China, you know, they've shown they're the factory of the world, at least for now, before Vietnam and Philippines and other places start creating all this stuff. And even in education, you could say China has shown they can turn out top students who come off to Stanford and come to the US and go to Tsinghua and Peking University, students who, you know, have worked really well and scored really high on these standardized tests. And what was interesting to me is when I was living in China, I think at the end of 2010, there was these international exams that were given all over the world among middle school or junior high students, and it's called the PISA. And the Chinese students came in #1 in the world at this time. And in fact, they even beat the West in English. You know, it's like, you know, how could we lose that, okay? And it caused a lot of navel-gazing and consternation in the US. At the time, I think it was December, President Hu Jintao was visiting Washington. The Tiger Mom book came out, you know. There was a lot of like, oh my God, we're losing here. What was interesting is I was reading Chinese blogs and other things, at least ones that are written in English that I could read, or listening to interviews with folks. And there were a lot of people in China actually questioning those results. Not saying that they didn't deserve them, but saying, is that what we really want? Is that really what we want to achieve? And people were questioning whether that Chinese educational system is leading to conformity and efficiency and turning out a lot of students who could take the test and do well, but not teaching creativity and innovation and educating a populace that's going to be able to solve the problems of the future. So it was interesting to me that there was this undercurrent of questioning those results going on. In the US, it's the opposite problem in some ways. Nobody says, oh, these American kids are not creative. But if you look at this report from the Broad Foundation, 68% of US 8th graders can't read at grade level and will never catch up. It's the fundamentals where in America we kind of are concerned and we want, no child left behind and have all this testing to make sure we can do the basics and hey, let's teach Singapore math, and I'm actually an advocate of such a thing. But again, you see both societies out of balance in some ways on this question. And in fact, the Tiger Mom book, which I've taken out of these slides, is marketed in China almost in the opposite way. It's marketed in the US as, hey, we should be more fundamental like in Asia. In China, it's almost marketed as, we need to be more like those US moms. You know, because in China, they actually had this guy, the wolf dad, who beat his kids if they didn't get A's. And, you know, they all went to Peking University and graduated, and that was like success. So she was seen as light, the tiger mom, okay? So education, I think, is a much harder one to think about. You know, if you have problems with those numbers I gave you before, this one's even harder to go, what's the goal here? What should you try to achieve? So, you know, one goal might be, could we help kids, whether they're from rural China or inner city Chicago, perform, you know, within the top 10 or 20% of those kids in Shanghai, who, by the way, were from some really very select schools versus the US ones were a little broader, so there's even a little cookery in those numbers. So could we do that? Now, on the other hand, that might just produce good test takers. Maybe that's, again, not what we wanted. In fact, this quote I like is attributed to Da Vinci. There's some controversy on the internet whether he actually said it, but I like it anyway. So it said, I've been impressed with the urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Being willing is not enough, we must do. To me, this is about balance, actually. You gotta know the fundamentals, you gotta learn the basics, but then you gotta use it. You gotta solve problems, you gotta build things, you gotta create things. And those together are how you really learn. That's what it says to me. Some other people have taken this quote to mean you don't need school and just get out there and do stuff. I think you actually need both, okay? So Peter Thiel maybe will read this in a different way. So maybe a more crunchy goal here, even less, you know, numeric would be, you know, how do we help kids increase their creative activities in school and daily life? I don't know how to even write this one, but it's kind of the direction. So kind of a far out project here that we barely started, it's more like we've written some early proposals about it, is kind of this idea of a smart primer. Has anyone here read Neil Stephenson's Diamond Age? Oh wow, this is a good audience. I usually get such a low number, it's really hard. So anyways, this book came out in about 1995-ish, and the idea of the Diamond Age, which the subtitle of the book is A Young Lady's Smart Primer, was this idea of this kind of, think of it looks like an iPad, at least that's how I see it. There are no pictures in the book. A tablet that's like a novel, except the girl who has it, she's actually a character in the story. And other girls who have it, they're characters in her story too. And she has to solve real problems in the real world for the story to progress and learn things. But it's a novel she has for like 10 years. You don't just read it for a month and you're done. It's like evolves with you. And at the time, I remember reading this in graduate school at Carnegie Mellon with some of the top AI grad students in the country, and we were all just, we need perfect AI for this ever to come to pass. So this would never happen. Then the iPad came out, and I started thinking about it, and I was like, wow, the hardware's there. What's the software? And I said, you know, there's the cognitive models at Carnegie Mellon for calculus and algebra tutors, and it works well. And there's all this content from Khan Academy, and you know, I got Scott and others teaching Coursera. There's stuff out there. To me, the hard part, and we got Wikipedia, and we could crowdsource different characters or different people. To me, the hard part is kind of the design HCI part. How do I create a story that weaves that stuff in a way that you would actually want to read it and keep interacting with it for years rather than months? How do you engage? I actually think, you know, there's some people who do interactive drama and stuff like that, that we actually could start to build such a thing. It might be still a 10-year project and require a lot of things, but I think this could be a different way to look at education. So there's a lot going on with massive online courses and things like this that kind of take traditional model of education and get it out there in online. I think those things mainly apply to people who are very motivated already by the current system and just don't have the time, or they live in the wrong place, they don't have the money. I actually think thinking about things like this might actually allow us to get to people who the current system just doesn't address. You know, they're not interested, they're not motivated. So looking at something that's a very different way to look at education maybe is something we do here. Again, this is just like an idea that, hey, if you want to work on it, talk to me. I have one person, one student who's starting to look into the beginning of this. So some early steps, though, that we've done here to look into this one are in terms of language learning. In Microsoft, working with my colleague there, Darren Edge, we had this idea, learning Chinese is really hard. Any expat living in China, all they talk about is how hard learning Chinese is. It takes about 2,500 hours to learn Chinese if you're an English speaker. it takes only 500 hours to learn a Romance language. So it's like 5 times as hard. I like to say I've had 300 hours of one-on-one Chinese tutoring. That's kind of equivalent to I've taken French 1, maybe French 2, okay? I can get around, but I can't have a conversation. So we were trying to think, how could we do education in your everyday life in between moments? So for example, let's say you had this Bluetooth headset in your ear, and you're sitting at a restaurant, and I'm waiting for my friend Eric to come. He's busy. He's going to be late. And so it knows I'm in a restaurant, and maybe it starts to prompt me to practice my Chinese. And it says, how do you say, can I see a menu? And I think in my head the answer. And unfortunately, in Chinese, for some of us Westerners, check and menu are sort of similar. Chinese people are just like, what? No, they are, trust me, okay? And so I think the wrong answer. And then the text-to-speech comes back with the right answer, and I'm like, damn, I mixed those two up again. And then using my muscle computer armband that a student of mine, Scott Saponis, developed as part of his PhD with Desni Tan at Microsoft, I could self-grade myself, put the fingers together, I got that wrong. People don't know what I'm doing, but I'm learning, okay? And so this was the basic idea of this system. And just to give you a little bit more, do I have to do anything to turn up the sound on here? Actually, I need audio output. I didn't plug this in, sorry. Anyone know where that cord is? Looks like this. Let's see if we can get some sound. Good, all right. Let's see how. So here's an idea of what this might look like.
How do you say subway?
Subway, 地铁
地铁 How do you say, have you got a subway map?
你有没有地铁地址
你有没有地铁地图?
Oh, I mixed up map with address.
Can you understand? 上车的时候小心车门.
When you get on the subway, mind the doors?
When you get on the subway, be careful of the train door.
Yes, I'm a genius. I need to get off soon. How do I get people to move? I already know how to say 对不起, but I'm sure there's something else. Hopefully I'll get a human translation before I need to get off. I like this answer. Let me practice it. 下车吗? 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 Okay, I think I'm ready to try. Yeah, I'm a Chinese master.
So again, that was just an envisionment of what we wanted, and we didn't have the muscle armband. In fact, he was just thinking you could just tap and with the accelerometer, no yes versus no, 1 tap versus 2. There's this idea that you might have this online community or crowdsource getting better translations, because if you've tried to do Chinese or other languages, Google Translate works pretty well, but when you get down to really needing something right, it often doesn't work. So you probably want people involved. And that video, boy, we made it, and it made me realize, boy, I've been saying this the wrong way for a year, how to get people to move on the subway. So the first real thing we built for this was something called Micro Mandarin. A paper on this appeared at Kai a year ago. Essentially context-based flashcards on your iPhone. We thought, hey, this is a much better way to learn stuff using the context of what your location is, bring up words that are relevant and learn them in that context, and you'll remember them better. So we did that, we built it, and we ran a study And we thought context-based flashcards would work better than what we call frequency-based. In the frequency-based case, what we did is we took the most common characters in the Chinese language and from a lexicon and then trained you on those first. So we ran a study comparing these. It was within subjects, 4 weeks, 2 conditions, 23 people. And what did we find out? It was actually a mixed result. More experienced people, who I'd call more intermediate or expert people, much preferred the context way, and novices hated it. They really preferred the frequency. And I guess in hindsight, it makes sense. You got to learn some basics before you could do much. But then when you're more advanced, you kind of want stuff that fits with the real world a little better, or with what your actual situation is at the moment. So I think in a real system, you probably want to offer these 2 different ways to get at it, rather than just think one way is the right way. Both of them are good, but it depends on the situation. So these are the 3 different areas that I wanted to talk about in terms of balance, where we're looking at both a new technology as well as design, and in fact, even in this case, the design of how you would use things in the real world. And there's underlying technology. Darren's posted other papers about even understanding the forgetting model for people on these kind of flashcards, and what's the right pattern to reshow them. Won a best paper award at Mobile HCI this year. So there's both technology and design to try to solve these problems. But I think some of the lessons that I've brought to me from my time in China and working on these kind of projects, both in the US and China, leads to a new style of design that I'm at the moment calling global design. And I think for us to solve these problems in health and education and the environment, we need to take this approach that's more human-centered, it's more social, it's more fun. But we also need to think about the technology. What happens when we have 100,000 times as much computation and storage on our body? What can we use that for? What new things is that going to enable? So try to think beyond just kind of, hey, what's the next Chi paper I can write, or NSF proposal I can do? What's a bigger thing you might try? And I think to solve these kind of hard problems requires a few things. One is what I call this design technology symbiosis. And maybe in Silicon Valley this is commonly thought of, but you actually need to do it, where we have designers and technologists working very closely together. Maybe this is the kind of thing that happens here at the D School, really closely together, taking advantage of those 2 different ways of thinking to solve these problems, I think is really important in these areas. And you've seen it in some of these problems I showed you, where there was really an interesting technology consideration, like Schwedek noticing pressure could just tell you what's going on in your pipe network. But then from a design perspective, saying, hey, just showing people graphs like Google did for energy isn't going to cut it in terms of making people understand where their usage is. And so trying to make sure you're focusing on both sides to solve these problems. The other one was leveraging diverse culture. Okay, so getting beyond making sure we have these multiple skill types among our people, or at least among our teams. Having different cultures gets people to think out of the box and solve problems different ways. There's some studies showing that people who travel the world more are more creative. Now, we don't know if it's causation or correlation. One theory is that by seeing even basic things done a different way in different places, like, hey, toilets are different in this place, it causes you to think more of, hey, what if I do this other thing different? It causes you to think more what if, changing the assumptions that you've grown up with. So I think this is important. And then I think this important one for many of these areas, especially education and the environment, is how do we get longer term engagement? A lot of what we do in HCI has been oriented for 40 years about designing for fairly short term tasks. And many of the lingo and other techniques we teach in our courses are really task based. But how do we start thinking about designing for activities that go over months or years, like learning a language? You don't learn Chinese in a few hours. Okay, changing your environmental behavior, it's going to take a while. Getting fit, I might want to lose 20 pounds. It's not going to happen next week. It's something that's going to take time and effort. How do we design around those things? I think is really important. So in terms of these problems that I think are fairly global, I've noticed at the time of Hu Jintao visiting the US, a lot of the press was about how we're in competition with China, and this is the next great race between East and West, et cetera. I actually feel for these problems, it's a world problem. We live in one world, especially the environmental one. Between us and China, we don't solve that together. It's not going to be solved by anyone, because that's where all of this energy use is happening. And so it's really important, I think, that we go beyond small collaborations and try to do something more significant in tackling these proposals. So one thing I've been trying to create is a new institute that's oriented towards this. It's called World Lab. The idea is to be the place for taking these risks, breaking the mold, really going after these hard problems. You're not going to solve them in 1 year. It's not to say you're not going to do shorter term research that leads to new papers and proposals, but having these big goals that are long term kind of re-energizes and changes how you think about your research. And this could be the kind of place to do that. Try to have this balance between academia and industry, between East and West, between design and technology, so having people come from these different areas. 2 sites to start. Why say we just do this in one place? So initially I've been talking with folks at Tsinghua in both computer science and design that have relationships, and we've started this with myself and others at UW. The real key is this crossflow, that you have people go back and forth. For these cultural things, you can't simply say, hey, yeah, we'll Skype, and really collaborate. You really need, for example, let's say a master's program where you spend a year in China, a year in the US, or a PhD where you do 4 years in your country and 2 years in another. And faculty who say, hey, yeah, every 5 years I'll go over there for a year, and it's not just going on sabbatical to hang out and go to nice restaurants. It's like, I'm going there to do work, okay? And then you're going to start imagining interesting technologies. So for example, let's say this was my lab here in Washington in the foreground, and behind that glass wall was a lab in Beijing, in Tsinghua, okay? And we could have awareness of what's going on the other side. Not a lot of overlap for me hours-wise, though the grad students work very crazy hours, so maybe we get more overlap. But you have awareness of what's on the tables, what's going on, and you can walk up to that window and have a conversation. There's folks in the graphics and vision community who are building such systems. We can imagine studying much more from the HCI perspective across the world like this. Who would you want to have in these places? I think the real key is this maker culture. Designers and folks who are doing computing, but I take both of those areas quite broadly. So for design, also I think of architecture and planning and art as these maker cultures. In computing, we have EE and ME people and physicists, people who create stuff. And then we also need folks who understand people, so psychology, sociology, understand ethnography, and also business, understand policy, behavior. You need all of these people, though I think the key core is really these makers on the design technology end is who should be the primary people you want to have in this place. Now you might say, why do you want to do this? It's pretty hard to create something across the Pacific. It's hard to deal with China, Tsinghua. They're very engaged with the government. It's very complicated. Besides just that I feel these problems need to be solved kind of between the US and China, and it's important, there's actually some practical reasons. So one is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the energy you sense among the people in China and the energy among the young technologists and designers is something you really want to tap into. And there's also energy among the government. They've had increasing in scientific funding of 15 to 20% for 10 years straight. Okay, so there's funding going into this. Now, you take numbers with a grain of salt, it doesn't all go into research. There's this maker culture. As they become this factory of the world, you're getting people who build things. They need it for design reasons. Good design pays. The iPad, iPhone, they're some of the most successful consumer products ever. It says designed by Apple in California, assembled in China on the back. Though out of $500 iPhone, only about $7 stays in China. About 25 to 50 goes to Japan, 25 to 50 goes to Korea, and Apple keeps over $200 because it's their design. So in China, they want to educate people who are going to be able to come up with some of these products of the future. From a US perspective, the market, you've seen these numbers, I'm sure, but it's huge. 1.3 billion people, over 1 billion mobile phones, 600 million people on the internet, and growing all the time. It's huge, and you can't just drop in an executive there for a few months and understand the culture and be able to take advantage of it. You have to actually live there and learn it. And in fact, now I feel like I'm getting a PhD in China in some ways in that it shows you how much I don't know. It just kind of leaves you with questions. It's complicated. How do we do this? Really in steps. We start with exchanges, then maybe a joint master's program, then some faculty positions, a PhD program, and then the final frontier in all of academic pursuits, space. Okay, the hardest to ever get. So this is where we are now. Exchanges. We did it this summer, something I call the World Lab Summer Institute. I had 11 Beijing students come to University of Washington, and then together with 9 Seattle students, we had 20 students. 5 teams of 4, almost half Chinese, half US on each side, half designers, half technologists. They worked for 7 weeks, boot camp. They had morning lectures, afternoon work on their projects, and then we took them to tours of some of the top research labs in the area, Google, Microsoft, Adobe, and then fun Boeing factory tour that if you've never been, you should go see how they make this stuff. Just to give you a little flavor for what they did before I conclude here. So that just give you a flavor of the projects they did. Used a lot of the techniques you see in the undergraduate HCI courses here, from paper prototyping to really, really high-end finished concept videos. Those are on the web if you go to the World Lab site. I don't have time to show you them, but they did projects in environment, trying to encourage recycling, a couple in education, one for kids to encourage to do things with their parents out of school, and another one for sharing different perspectives on world topics. And then also one for kids learning how to express emotions through drawings. And then finally, this one in kind of similar to UbiFit, trying to encourage people to exercise in little bits more in their daily life with kind of this projected tattoo on your arm. Watch that video, it's quite cool. Let me skip through these. A lot of people helped work on this. Couldn't have done it without this industry support, as well as support of my endowed professorship that from Short Dooley. And finally, I want to leave you with this Chinese saying. For the Chinese folks, apologize my bad Chinese. Shi nian shu mu bai nian shu ren. And I was surprised when I first read this. I actually could translate this, so I maybe learned a little more Chinese than I thought. This means 10 years to grow a tree, 100 years to educate people, which kind of says that education is a long-term important investment to the future and prosperity of our society. And to me, this is what the World Lab idea is all about. And I appreciate your comments afterwards and questions and help in making this a reality. And so I thank you for your time.